Everyone. Um, so today, decolonizing the academy, the grassroots, the sites of alternative knowledge. Quite a dry title. It was actually drier before that because it was about alternative epistemologies. So Maxwell said to me, I think you might need to kind of revise that. So, so I thought, okay, I will probably, I was thinking when I was preparing this that I would treat you as I treat my own students. So when I teach critical theory, or when I used to teach critical theory at MMU, ManMet, I used to always, rather than lecture my students around these sort of complex theories, it's much more interesting and actually easier to comprehend if we look at your knowledge and we kind of co-learn some of the theory and explore and discover the theory together. So that's what we're going to do today. So the abstract for this talk or this discussion is basically the context of The Roads Must Fall and Why is My Professor White and the whole kind of decolonizing the academy. We're going to look at what that actually means, because I'm not entirely sure that everybody means the same thing when they use that term. We're going to look at the real world implications of this ambition, and we're actually going to examine how that differs to decolonializing the academy, because people conflate the two, but they're actually two different things. So we're going to get into that today. So we're going to use the format of a discussion. So as I'm going to be really interested in your thoughts, and I'm not going to necessarily see you put your hands up when you do that hands up feature, just jump in, but if you could just say your name and where you're from and what you're studying as a very brief introduction, and then jump in with your thoughts or questions. And I think that would be a good way of us conducting the discussion. So at the end of this, I'm hoping that we can begin to come, I'm just moving us all out the way, come to a sort of strategic action plan. And what I mean by that is some ideas of how you will be able to take some of this knowledge forward into your own activism and in your own settings. So we're not going to come up with a full detailed action plan because that's just not possible in 40 minutes. But if we can begin to have the seeds of thoughts and ideas that you can then apply in your settings, then I'll be really, really happy about that. So let's move on to the meat. So I'm going to try to get us to explore two really important words, which kind of leads to the conversation we just had before about why some of these papers and books are so difficult to understand. Well, the reason why they're so difficult to understand is because they're complex. So what we're going to do, we're just going to unpack some of that together as a group. So epistemology. Epistemology is a fancy word for the study of knowledge. That's all it means. And I say that's all it means, but if you can see on the slide, if we borrow from Stuart Hall's Circuit of Culture, which I think is a really useful template to use, where Stuart Hall was talking about how culture is produced and who owns it, how is it represented, how is it regulated, how is it consumed, whose identity is produced through culture. When you look at those questions, you can actually apply that to knowledge. So if we're looking at the study of knowledge, let's apply these questions. How is knowledge represented? How is knowledge produced? How is knowledge consumed? And how is knowledge regulated? And how is identity communicated through knowledge? So let's just open it up. How is knowledge produced? Any ideas? What do you think? I'm only interested in your opinions and considered ideas, so there aren't really any right or wrongs. It's just a discussion. So I'm opening the floor to trying to get some sense of how you think knowledge is produced.
So if someone wants to make a contribution, should they message on the chat first and then unmute, or how would you like
Just,
to?
just unmute and say your name and where you're from and where you're studying.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm happy to kickstart off. So I'm
Yep.
Maxwell, Imperial College, and I study civil engineering. One way knowledge would be produced would be through literature, so books, journals, so written media.
Okay. Okay. Any other ideas? Please don't be shy. We can't learn if we're shy.
Hey, I'm Akshat. I'm from India, living in Dubai. I study medicine at Imperial, and uh, knowledge is also produced through like experience and word of mouth. Um, yeah.
Okay. So far, knowledge is produced through experience and word of mouth, but also through literature and media. So I'm just going to say, in terms of the literature and media, let's put that as representation, because that's the next stage of knowledge. And in terms of experience, let's put that in terms of identity, shall we? Because if we're talking about your lived experience, then how you perceive that experience and how you harvest that knowledge of your personal experience has to come maybe through a prism of your identity. So shall we? Okay. So how else is knowledge produced?
Hi, my name is Osama. I'm a second year medic from Manchester. Knowledge could be produced by feedback, I guess, from trying something and then seeing what the response is. Like if you going back ancestrally, if you go fishing in a certain spot and you don't catch any fish, then you adjust and go to a different place.
Okay. Okay. So that almost sort of overlaps with experience, doesn't it? Because you're talking about learning from experience. So there is a branch of epistemology or epistemological thinking called phenomenology. So the thinker Merleau-Ponty. Before I do that, I've uploaded, everybody who's sort of just joined us, I've uploaded 2 documents for you to download from the chat. One document is the presentation for you to read through later on. And then the other document is further reading, where I will be going into, or have gone into, sort of more theoretical applications of the knowledge that we're going to be talking about. And we're also going to be talking about ontology, and also my biographies there as well. So if any of you are sort of wondering who is this guy, then you can sort of read that document and see who I am. So in terms of theory, phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, he talks about discovering who you are and the knowledge of who you are through your lived experiences as you live them. So that is another framework that can be applied here. There are lots of others, but I'm just hoping we can maybe come up with some of our own. So how is knowledge consumed then?
Hey, I'm Ishaya. I'm a medic at Imperial. I would say knowledge can be consumed through many ways. Certainly, like if you're being taught something either from your parents or at school or through reading, things like that.
Okay, so for the first time we've got the mention of being taught knowledge. That's actually it sounds like a bit of an innocuous thing, because, well, it's obvious you are taught knowledge. So if we take that as a common sense point of view, now common sense is a technical term, believe it or not. coined by Antonio Gramsci. And what he meant by common sense was the consensus in society that things are the way they are because they are. And it's like a common sense view. And he kind of talked about hegemony, which is a technical term for the negotiation of this common sense point of view without revolution or bloodshed. So it's about how do we get you to think that education is really good without forcing you to think that. How do we negotiate that societally? How do we turn that into a common sense point of view? So you mentioned taught and teaching, which is a common sense point of view of how education is consumed by students, I guess, or learners, and how knowledge is produced by the teachers in order to represent it or broadcast it. So let's just break that down. So teachers teach, but where does that knowledge come from?
I'd say like historical accounts of kind of experiences. It depends. Like if it's science, then it's somebody who's experimented something and found something to be true. So they write it down through literature or kind of visually represent it, and that's what teachers use to learn and teach further. For each subject, kind of the way you acquire knowledge kind of changes.
Yeah.
But
I'm going to problematize that. So the word problematize means asking questions about assumptions. So we're very slowly taking you through some very sort of complicated and high level academic jargon, which you will read in papers, but we're just applying it to this discussion. So scientists who made discoveries and with their experiments, and that's written down and then kind of communicated through history. So then we need to then talk about the identity. Who then comes up with the knowledge? So if we talk about scientists, let's just use science, and I'm not a scientist, but so you'll have to kind of bear with my ignorance. Scientists have identities, as do all human beings, but these identities, if we're now going to look at the circuit of culture from Stuart Hall, actually exist within a cultural perspective. So if knowledge is generated from a person's point of view or identity, so let's call it a scientist, then their cultural position has to be taken into consideration to give context to the science or the knowledge that they're producing. Now, the reason why that's important is because we can all think of examples where other non-Western inventions or pieces of knowledge are not held to the same value as Western pieces of knowledge. So already, when we're talking about epistemology, identity of where and who is producing this knowledge becomes really important. And then if you look across to regulation, so that's interesting in this context of culture, of knowledge, because knowledge obviously has to be regulated in order to join the canon of literature, of whatever field it is you're studying in. So let me see if I can explain that. If your field is dominated by European thinkers, and the European thinkers come from a certain European culture, and I'm thinking more in terms of philosophical culture, then the knowledge that produces is by its very nature going to be exclusionary, isn't it? Because you're not necessarily going to be getting the viewpoints of other thinkers or scientists from around the world who aren't plugged into Eurocentrism. So if you're at university and you have a reading list to wade through, then regulation becomes quite an important thing, because then who regulates that reading list? Because that reading list is ostensibly where your knowledge for your discipline is going to come from in terms of your further reading. Who curates that? Obviously it's your lecturer, obviously, but in terms of the background of your lecturer, in terms of the identity of your lecturer, what canon are they drawing from in order to regulate that knowledge that then you are then consuming? And then of course, how is that represented? So when we talk about epistemology, all of these issues around knowledge, where did it come from? How is it used? How is it represented? How is it regulated? What does that knowledge say about the identity of the people either producing the knowledge or representing the knowledge? All of that is wrapped up in the term epistemology. So hopefully I've kind of given you a taste of the complexity of that word, which is why when critical theorists use epistemology, it's a shorthand for all of that discussion, because they'll have to write a paper about all of that discussion before saying what they really want to say. So we're just going to go through a similar process with another word, ontology. So ontology is the study of being, the theory of being, consciousness. So you will have heard about thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Hegel, amongst other people, who were very interested in what are called metaphysics. And so the study of metaphysics is about, who am I? And who are you? And what is the difference between you and me? In fact, it's even more basic than that. It's about what is the nature of reality. So there are a few theories, well, quite a few theories, which we're not really going to go through because that's in your further reading. But before I add anything else to this, let's have a similar discussion around ontology. So let's see. Ontology is the study of being. So how is that represented? This is actually a harder chart to apply, but it does work, but it requires us to think a little bit more deeply. How is that applied in terms of representation? How do we represent our being?
Hey, I'm Manu. I'm also a second year medic at Imperial, and I don't know if this is right for this one, but I was thinking, like, when you say represented, you can also talk about books, TV, all of that, like media, but maybe more in terms of like societal norms. So that's where we like understand that, like, who am I, who is that person, like just based off what everyone else is doing rather than actually being taught something.
Fantastic. So I suppose I am going to have to weave in theory as we go along because it's just coming to me. So Judith Butler, who is a philosopher in queer studies and gender studies, but who also critiques Freud and Althusser, amongst other people, she would say that so the word subject, so when in research, and it might be a different meaning in the natural sciences, but in the social sciences and in philosophy, when we talk about a subject, that's an interesting word. We mean a person that we're writing about. The subject said this, the subject said that, or felt that. But where the word comes from is quite interesting, because the subject means someone who is subjected. That's where it comes from. Now, to subject means actually to dominate. So when we're talking about a subject, we're actually talking about an entity that is somehow dominated by power. And that process of being dominated or shaped by power is called subjectivation. Now, the reason why that's interesting is because Judith Butler, in her Psychic Life of Power, she talks about how, as an individual, we are hailed by societal norms. So she calls societal norms power with a big P. And power brings us into existence. So we become aware of our who we are and who we are in relation to society, and most importantly, societal expectations of us. Then she says that we internalize those societal expectations, and then we internalize it to such a degree that we own it as though it's ours. We are no longer aware that it's societal. We think it's ours. And we have power, but now with a small p. And we then exert our small p power onto other people. And she says that not only do we come into being as social beings through power with a big P, but the fact that we own power with a small p, because we've taken it on board, we then alter the big P, the big power, societal power. So we're sort of made by power, but we're making power at the same time. Does that make sense? So she's really talking about how do we become subject to power? How are we subjectivated? And she says we take on societal mores and expectations, we own it, we forget that it's society's, and we con ourselves into thinking it's my idea. Of course I'm meant to be this, because I am, it's me, it's my idea. And then I start judging you guys for not ascribing to those standards that I've made up, not realizing that really I'm just kind of mimicking or parroting societal expectations. So that is really interesting if we kind of open that up to the study of being. So Kant and Hegel. So in the further reading that I've uploaded, I've uploaded a chapter from one of my books where I look at Hegel's metaphysics and how the metaphysics of being through Hegel, who was a fierce critic of Immanuel Kant, is applied to political philosophy as through the lens of C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian writer. Now, if we look at Hegel and Kant, and even if we go back to Plato and his theory of forms and Plato's cave, what we're talking about is, does reality exist outside of our heads or in our heads? Where is reality? So if we zoom a bit further, obviously, from Plato to Descartes and his famous, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. Quite surprised I remembered that, actually. That was sort of quite revolutionary, because what Descartes was saying for the first time, I guess, in, well, maybe not the first time, just bear with me. I've just told everyone not to ring me because I'm working and someone's rung me. So I've just gotten rid of that. Apologies, everyone. So what Descartes did, which was sort of quite revolutionary at the time, was he said that there is a separation between the body and the mind. He's saying that the mind is unknowable because it's private, it's the mind, but the body is visible. However, because I can think, then the actual act of my thinking is the creation of my existence. So the reason why that's really important in the context of ontology is that in Europe, in European thinking or Eurocentric thinking, there is this duality between the mind and the body, which in other societies, the mind and the body are kind of considered the same, or the same thing, two sides of the same coin, rather than two separate entities. Now, if we're looking at science, that has kind of a profound implication for how we view science, how we view medicine, how we view the mind. So if we're looking at the science of the mind, psychology. So already we're now looking at a culture, a Eurocentric culture, that has shaped the meaning of what reality is. So if we now take in and roll up Plato with Descartes, with Kant and Hegel, and we look at the whole thing, metaphysics, where they're saying that reality is somehow beyond what we see, beyond our five senses. Coincidentally, people like John Locke and the Bishop Berkeley were talking about reality was formed through our sensations. So there actually isn't reality beyond our sensations. So that was those are competing arguments of the time. And the interesting, this has become more of a talk than I imagined. So I do apologize. I will open open the floor in a minute.
No worries.
I told you I can go
Just
off.
continue. No, it's fine. It's fine.
So the reason why that's sort of really quite interesting, if we're really going to update it to the present day, using the films like The Matrix, which is one of my all-time kind of favorite films, and if we kind of just briefly cross over into quantum mechanics, all of it is related, I promise. So in quantum mechanics, the latest sort of theory is that there's like a 2D representation of reality, which is then projected across the external limits of a black hole into the universe, as to be cast as a 3D, as our 3D reality. So part of the M-brain theory, and which is again part of string theory. So I'm not really going to go into that, but the reason why I'm mentioning that is that we're basically talking about hologram and holographic representation in our science today. So in metaphysics, if we go back 300 years ago, when we're talking about Immanuel Kant or Bishop Berkeley and even John Hume, and Locke, David Hume and John Locke, we are even then beginning to talk about the nature of reality in terms of, does it exist out there or does it exist in here? So, and if it exists through our senses, are we then talking about holographic representations of what we think reality is? And if we are those holograms representing a reality that we just can't touch because we're trapped in our holographic representation? Or is reality those holograms? Right. Now, the reason why that's important, and all of that is wrapped up in that word ontology, is because if you view people as being fragmented in terms of mind and body as your really basic point of view, your worldview, then I guess how you treat people is going to be sort of quite important. So if we then go to the Enlightenment and just a bit past the Enlightenment, and we're looking at the early years of libertarianism, and we're talking about, so libertarianism was a movement, a philosophical movement that came out of, I guess, the kind of feudal era of the kings, monarchy, and the divine right to rule. So libertarianism sort of came about by saying, well, look, you don't, as a king or queen, you don't have the divine right to rule over me because I'm an individual with a God-given right of freedom and liberty. And now what's interesting about that pronouncement is that we're kind of beginning to talk about human rights and what defines us as an individual. And just a little bit prior to that movement, you had the seminal human rights debate in Valladolid between Sepulveda and Las Casas, who were Spanish thinkers who were debating whether the Native Amerindians of the Americas were human enough to be spared slavery or not. And the argument used there was, are they able to become Catholic? Are they able to become Christianized? Because if they are, then they have a soul, they are human beings, and they deserve not to be enslaved, which is what Lacasas was saying. The other argument was, well, they're savages because they indulge in cannibalism and blah, 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 blah. Now, but what's interesting about that is that this Eurocentric duality between mind and body, they have a soul, they can be Christianized, underpinned the very nature of how they were categorized as either human beings or non-human beings, or beings or non-beings. So we can begin to see the root of Eurocentric philosophy, Eurocentric thinking about ontology, about being. So if you zoom slightly forward, so I think the Valladolid debates were in 1518 or something like that. And if you kind of zoom forward maybe 100, 150 years or so, when John Locke was writing, this whole thing about freedom and liberty, it's interesting because the Atlantic and other slave trades, other routes, but I'm going to stick with the Atlantic for now. The Atlantic slave trade was kind of in full swing. The Brits weren't quite there, so I guess it wasn't in full swing because it only really was in full swing when the British perfected the slave trade. But it was, there. And these wonderful words are being written, but they weren't applied to non-white people. They weren't applied to Africans. And Thomas Jefferson, when he was writing the Bill of Rights in the US, don't know when, is it 1744 or thereabouts, and he uses the term inalienable rights, but of course that didn't apply to the indigenous people there, or the slaves that were taken over. So you already have, the reason why I'm going around the houses is because you have this schism, this Cartesian schism between mind and body, which then enables you to treat people as though they don't have a mind and they're just a body, so certain treatment is justified. So in America, you had African slaves were considered only 3/5 human and were considered without a soul. And the reason why they were considered without a soul is because of that Cartesian duality. Now, if you look at other world cultures, from the African continent all the way through to the Indian subcontinent, through to Chinese, or I'd say Buddhist philosophies, there's no such schism. The mind and body form one. So it's difficult in those worldviews to dehumanize people because people in those worldviews already come with a mind and body and a soul, all intricately wrapped up into one body, the human being. Whereas in the West, we've fragmented that. So I've just kind of, in my little monologue, and I do apologize for that, I've just kind of outlined some of the complexities behind the word ontology, which is why it's used. And just to recap some of the equivalent complexities around epistemology. Right, so why have we kind of gone around the houses to talk about epistemology and ontology? The reason is colonization. So we're kind of getting to the nub of it now. So we're just going to watch a very short video called Concerning Violence.
Colonialism is not a thinking machine, nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence.
Mission, vi förbjuder ju att församlingsmedlemmar ska ha mer än en hustru till exempel.
This is my home. This is where I intend to die.
In September 1962, the Congress of the Mozambican Liberation Front affirmed unanimously the will and determination of the Mozambican people to fight for national independence. Long live Africa!
Right, so I'm going to stop sharing for a sec because I just need to get rid of that. Otherwise it will play in the background, which I don't want. And find you all again and reshare. So just bear with me. I am sharing. That's not what I want to share. So, I see what I've done. A technical hitch, but I will get it back. Clicking off that video, I've clicked off the presentation. But so the reason why I played you that is, so I'm going to just chat whilst I try and solve this. Right, I've solved it. Now I'm getting it shared with you. The reason why I played you that is because The Wretched Earth by Frantz Fanon is an amazing book, and I've given you a link to it from my collection, my Google Drive collection, for you to read. Now, Concerning Violence is an essay from that book, which talks about colonialism, where it came from, and how it morphs into capitalism. So he's drawn an incredibly precise, clear picture that shows how what we live with today came from colonialism from the past. So I'm just desperately scrabbling around trying to share this with you, and I'm not entirely sure why I can't share.
When you click share screen, does it come up with the different windows?
Yeah, so I'm literally just sharing my screen, and I'm just...
Yeah, and if you try if maybe if you minimize, I don't know, it might show your desktop, but I don't know if you have the PDF open.
Ah,
Yeah,
thank
there
you.
you go. Yeah,
There we go. Thank you very much.
no worries.
So the reason why I can stop sort of rambling now. The reason why we watched that trailer for that film, so the film itself is a visualization of the essay. It's an incredible film, which if you can hunt that down and watch it, it will explain so much. And if you can read the book or read the essay from the book, even better. Right, so now we have a better understanding of epistemology and ontology. I want to ask you now, what is colonization? And we're going to use the tools of epistemology and ontology in the following ways. How was knowledge produced, represented, and regulated to the colonized? And how, and in terms of ontology, how was the theory of being, how did the theory of being underpin the colonialists' view of themselves and of the people that they colonized? So I've opened the floor, so can we have some ideas?
So I think one way of, in terms of maybe this kind of overlaps with regulation and being, there was a very clear sort of power structure, or like a racial hierarchy, where you've got the white Europeans, they are on top, they're dominant. You'll see that they're in the higher positions in government, and then lower down, then you might have maybe one or two of the ethnic race of the colony, maybe given like a few select positions, but the masses were either poor, suppressed. Censorship, maybe another way as well, limiting what you can tell the masses, and propaganda as well, to sort of reinforce the idea that the colonizer is dominant and the colonized should be subjugated and suppressed.
Fantastic. Now, if we just quickly go back to this circuit of culture, this is for ontology, but it's the same for epistemology. We can see those mechanisms of what you've just said, Maxwell, in terms of regulation, representation, the identity, how it's produced and how it's consumed. We can see that in Stuart Hall's circuit of culture. So I think that's the circuit of culture is a really good framework for understanding how knowledge, and of course the theory of being, ontology, is used to form power structures within colonization. Any other ideas?
So just reading from the chat as well, we've had one contribution from Osama. So subjecting someone else's epistemology to your own ontology, subjecting your representation, identity, prism of knowledge, etc., onto other people.
Yes, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Maxwell, I'm going to ask if you can be my eyes and if you can monitor.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
that's
so
brilliant.
if anyone else, if you're not comfortable, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
And put in the chat. Yeah, please do.
Put it through the chat, please. Yeah, that's fantastic. So we are talking about a kind of imposition of ideas and an imposition of being as well. So if we're talking about the sort of European, Eurocentric, because it's not just European, but it is Eurocentric, sort of way of being, where colonization is about civilizing. That's what it's about. It's about civilizing the people who are being dominated. So the people are not actual people or beings until they have become civilized through the colonization process. And at that point, they become beings, they become civilized, but they're not full beings because they still don't share the status of the colonizers. So that's an important point to kind of keep in mind. And then if we look at decolonial thinkers like Grossfogel and Annabelle. So I've given you an introduction to Walter Mignolo and Annie Bell Quijano in my further reading notes. They were sort of the architects of the decolonial movement. So you'll be able to read about what they were saying and how they came about. So they basically said that when we talk about the Enlightenment, which was when Europe sort of became Europe intellectually. So Europe had two births. It had the coming together and the forming of nation states after the 30 Years' War and all of that, and the other wars. And that came together, I think it was 1614 in the Treaty of Westphalia. So you guys can Google that and get more accurate years than me. But I think it was that. And the Treaty of Westphalia was the time when the different nation states, but they weren't actually nation states, they were sort of regions that were part of the Holy Roman Empire and that were part of different empires, came together and actually drew their borders for the first time. And once they drew their borders and formed this treaty in Westphalia, Europe as an idea actually was born, because Europe became a collection of nation states that wasn't quite what we have today, but was sort of quite near, was sort of on the way to that. So that was the first birth of Europe in terms of its consciousness as a, because don't forget, before that, with all the different empires, so of course you had Rome, which obviously subjected Europe to its empire. Because I think one of the things we need to kind of disabuse ourselves of is the belief that the European identity is old. It's from the Greeks and the Romans, but that's simply not true. Europe as a concept didn't really exist until more or less the 17th century. Prior to that, you just had lots of warring ethnic groups or tribes that were fighting for supremacy. So once the different tribes of Europe came together and sacked Rome and Rome fell, Rome then had to assert its power, not necessarily as an empire, but through its religion, through, wasn't the Caesar, but the power of the Caesar got transferred into the Pope. And then you had the Holy Roman Empire, which then unified people. But it wasn't Europe, it was still Roman. So I think what I'm trying to say is that this feeling, this European identity that went out and colonized the world, actually is a quite recent phenomenon, which came about through the coming together of nation states, through the Treaty of Westphalia, and then intellectually it came through the Enlightenment. So prior to the Enlightenment, you had the sacking of Rome, and then all the way from the sacking of Rome to the Enlightenment, that we normally call that the Dark Ages, the medieval era, the Dark Ages. And what's interesting about the Dark Ages, I am going off piste a little bit, but it is sort of related, is that during that time, from the Roman Empire through to the Enlightenment, the Ottoman Empire and sort of Arabic scholarship was actually really important for shaping the world. So we call it in Europe the Dark Ages because it was dark in Europe, but it wasn't dark in other parts of the world, in North Africa where the universities were, and in the Middle East, and even in the Far East where, you know, you sort of had all of these amazing scholars, but it was dark in Europe. And the reason why I kind of mentioned that is because there's a term called, let's see if I can remember it. I can't remember the Latin for it, but in English, it's the translation of study. It will come to me. But the translation of study was where what we now call the European canon of knowledge actually came from, you know, the Islamic world and other cosmologies. And then we translated that into Greek through sort of Greek knowledge, and then obviously transmitted that into Rome, and then later on into sort of our Enlightenment thoughts. But what's interesting is that other knowledge isn't recognized or isn't acknowledged in the forming of European epistemology. So another technical term for this, because this now touches on whiteness and what whiteness actually means. Right. So you are getting a lot of theory now. This is quite interesting. It's just me talking and rambling on forever. So whiteness, white supremacy. Oh, in fact, I'll go even further back. So you have prejudice, which is just bigotry, personal bigotry. But if you add prejudice to power in terms of the institutions, and let's say it's kind of racial prejudice, then you kind of have structural racism. But if you then add history to that institutional power, so what we're saying is, yes, but it's always been like this because institutions from way back, and you know, the propaganda and the lies of, oh yes, the Roman Empire was all white, and when the Romans were here, you know, in the UK, it was just all white, when we actually know it was multicultural, and we know that there wasn't a concept of whiteness either in ancient Greece or for the Romans. We know for a fact that the North Africa, the British Celts and Picts were considered more barbarian. Well, they're considered barbarian, whereas the North African kind of dark-skinned people were not, because they were part of the Roman Empire, which is why we know that we've had a black Libyan person ruling parts of the UK. I think he was called Septimus. You'll have to Google that. So what I'm trying to say is the concept of race didn't really come into the modern understanding of race until much, much, much later. And I guess looping back, only came into being when you were able to separate the mind and the body. So you were able to kind of just treat people as objects because they didn't have souls. They kind of had minds, but not souls. So they weren't considered really human beings. Yet, in order to get to that stage of being superior, they had to, the people of that time, the thinkers of that time, had to learn the knowledge and had to absorb the epistemology of other cultures from around the world historically. But not acknowledging that, the technical term is called disavowal. Disavowing, and it's a disavowal, where they are denying the existence of those other knowledges that influenced and formed their knowledge. Now, the reason why that's important is because white supremacy, whiteness needs blackness in order to exist. Without blackness, there is no whiteness. So if we take it all the way back to when whiteness was actually located in race, in order to justify the economic exploitation of the slaves, African slaves, and I am talking about the transatlantic slave route, and I am aware that there are many others like the Pacific and others, which I know less about. In order to justify the industrial scale, because you see, before slavery, it's okay, so many theories upon theories. So I'm hoping you're kind of following me, because I'm doing my best to kind of unravel these kind of Russian doll theories within theories. So people say, well, there's always slavery. There's always been slavery. So what's the difference between transatlantic African chattel slavery and, say, the slavery in ancient Greece or the Romans? But you see, this is where I answer them back. There's always been transport. So in transport, human beings have always wanted to get to A to B. But the question is, how do they do that? And the how is so important because if you think about it in transport, how humans have traveled from A to B has defined whole eras and epochs. So from the era of mass migration out of Africa on foot, to the era of discovering the wheel, to the era of discovering maritime travel, to the era of discovering the railways and obviously aeroplanes. Each mode of transport has defined an era, and each mode of transport has with it ethical considerations. So the most obvious ethical consideration today is air travel and obviously environmentalism, environmental issues and pollution. But of course, you know, cars and roads and pollution. So if we look at slavery, taking the model of transportation, we can see that slavery has existed, but it has existed in different modes in different periods. So in the same way that it would be ridiculous to say flying to the moon is just like walking, because they are both modes of transportation, but they're not really comparable. We then have to think about the different types of slavery. So what makes transatlantic slavery special and unique to the other types of slavery is, like in other cultures that enslaved, there wasn't this duality between mind and body. So the slave was still a human being and still had certain rights. So in some cultures, slaves could still ascend in society and occupy positions of power. Slaves could become free. All sorts of things, depending on the culture that slavery came from. Slaves were sometimes prisoners of war, but they always had rights and they always were regarded as human beings, but under some sort of contract. But what makes African chattel slavery so different was, for the first time in human history, in order to justify the industrial scale needed to kickstart European economies, because don't forget, it was about how do you pick the cotton or extract the sugarcane at the lowest cost possible to gain the highest, the kind of highest profit. In order to justify that exploitation of human labor, you had to make them not human, non-beings. It wouldn't work otherwise. You literally couldn't treat human beings as property, chattel. So you had to dehumanize them and use that kind of Cartesian duality, schism between the mind and the body to do that. Now, at that point, for the first time, and this is kind of where the decolonialists kick in, is that labor, slave labor, for the first time was linked to skin color and this idea of blackness. So whiteness then became important because we need to have this work to be done. Otherwise we're not going to make our money, but we can't do it. So we need a mechanism that justifies the enslavement and exploitation, obviously, of another group of human beings. So what do? We dehumanize them. Now, this is where ontology and epistemology comes into the colonial process. In order to dehumanize people, and let's just take African slaves as an example, you actually had to strip away their kinship, their culture, their languages, everything that made them rich human beings actually had to be stripped away. Now, if you read Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, brilliant book. I've not included that on the reading list, but please include that for yourselves. He talks about the invention of the Negro. So the Negro is a technical term that alludes to this dispossessed person whose culture and epistemology and ontology, sense of self, was stripped away purely for the function of being a slave or a worker. So they became an empty shell. So colonialism works at the level of stripping away all of what we talked about in terms of epistemology and ontology, and what Stuart Hall talks about in terms of culture, our culture, and turns the being into an entity of utility, but not of being.
Okay.
So let's just quickly, because I have a feeling we're running out.
Yeah, I was going to say that I'm conscious we've passed the 5 o'clock mark, so if you're able to actually, before you just move on, I just wanted to sort of mention a contribution Isabel wrote, kind of linking to what you were saying about whiteness and blackness. She said race science, a pseudoscience that tried to categorize people into distinct groups based on biological and physical characteristics, and using this to enforce the idea that one race is scientifically superior/inferior. But we now know that race is a meaningless biological category. It's more of a social idea. So I think that point ties into what you've just been talking about.
Totally. So you had scientific racism, which only officially ended in the 1960s, by the way. As late as that, within people's lifetimes, well, not your lifetimes, but well, actually not my lifetime either, I can say, but only just, but ended within living memory, I should say. So obviously that came from polygenism, was it Isabel described in terms of the category of different races. So you had the black man, the white man, and the yellow man, actually. So I will send you a link to a talk I did on the conversation in a podcast called Mythbusters, where I talk about polygenism and its influence today around today's thinking. Again, I should have really put that in the reading list, but I didn't remember.
Fine. Yeah, you can send that after. That's
brilliant. Just didn't remember I did that until just now. Right, okay. So we're going to rush through this. Okay, because we are running out of time. Right. Before we get on to education and grassroots, I will have to do a little bit of a talk, and then we can have a Q&A at the end of that, I guess. Right. So decoloniality. So colonization is about the imposition of ontology and epistemology onto a colonized set of people. Okay, so within that, we actually have to assume, because it is correct, that the people themselves, the colonized people, had their own ontologies and epistemologies, their own cosmologies, their own creation stories, and their own kind of visions of how the universe and their place in the universe stands, and they have their own stories. Okay, so colonization is about displacing their stories with the Western story of being and knowledge. Right, so that's colonization. So decolonization is about trying to get back to pre-colonial epistemologies and ontologies. Now, decoloniality, so this is important, so in terms of trying to explain the difference between the two. So coloniality comes from Annabel Quijano, that's in the reading list. He talks about the coloniality of power. So what he's saying is that if you can understand how colonialism happened and all the mechanisms that we've spoken about and I've kind of prattled on about, and the mechanisms that you've seen alluded to in the Frantz Fanon film, and extract that from the colony itself and apply that to how power is manifested and used in general in society. So how power is used to indoctrinate people, used to strip people of their identities in order to replace their identities with social mores or social expectations or market expectations, which we haven't gone into, but you can read my work where I talk about how whiteness is then morphed into what we call the market. But you can read about that because I don't have any time to talk about that. So coloniality of power is about structures, not about colonies or about colonizers or the colonized. That's colonization. Coloniality is about power. So the same power that was used to colonize people is the same power that's being used to set up structures within society.
Yeah.
So decoloniality then becomes about how do you manage and address the power imbalances within the structures. So when we talk about decolonize the curriculum, what we actually mean is how do we decolonialize the curriculum? How do we improve the reading lists? How do we expand the reading list? How do we kind of make it more relevant to a worldview? So a worldview, great. Another technical term, connected histories by Gaminda Bambra, who talks about how it's actually all of the world histories interconnect to form modernity. Modernity didn't just sort of happen in Europe spontaneously. It happened through all of that kind of epistemological exchange that made Europe, Europe. So we need to kind of connect each other's histories. So when we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, that's really what people are talking about. How do we look at the curriculum? How do we get more black professors? Why is my professor white? But what we're not talking about is how do we scrap the curriculum and rebuild it on the terms of pre-colonial epistemologies? And no one's talking about that. That's really hard to do. So that's kind of the really sort of important sort of distinction between decoloniality. So of course and decolonization. So there's coloniality of power. There's also coloniality of being. So we're actually being colonized, to kind of borrow that phrase from colonization, into being, in neoliberal terms, market actors, market subjects, rather than social subjects. But we don't have time. So you'll either have to read my work or invite me on again to kind of talk about that, but we don't have time to do that. So the reason why I mentioned grassroots is that if we then think about our local communities that come from all around the world, traditionally, what are the knowledges and practices that we can amplify from our local communities that can help us resist this whiteness or marketization or coloniality of being? So there's one paper, really briefly talk to you about this one paper that is in the reading list. I was part of a group campaigning to save a local heritage centre, which got closed down and sold off in the end. But the process was quite interesting because the community was saying, we have solutions to our own challenges. Why are you as a university sort of trying to talk down to us to say that we can help you with this when we didn't ask you for that help? Actually, you're not listening to us. We're saying the help we need is resources, blah, 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 but what you're giving us is not actually relevant. So this kind of like clash of kind of epistemological starting points between the community and the university. The community knowledge that came out of this was about cooperative economics. The communities were saying, right, we need to club together and see not only how we can raise money to buy the centre, but how we can look at our economies, boosting trade within our communities. And one of the models, two models came out of that. One model was looking at how knowledge was transmitted from elders through to young people in terms of intergenerational kind of knowledge holding. And the other one was the partner system, which came from the Caribbean, which is a system of community borrowing. So the community actually formed its own models of knowledge, epistemology, that it wanted to apply to help itself. But those models weren't recognized as knowledge by the university. So the paper, which I've, so in the further reading list, I've included links to all the reading materials so that you can get them, read them for free. So in that particular paper, you'll kind of see how the epistemologies between grassroots communities and the universities. So the universities very much represent a kind of colonial presence in a community. And if not colonial, there is a definite coloniality of power in terms of how universities affect their local communities. And grassroots communities can be thought of in terms of the colonized, in terms of their cosmologies and epistemologies, which they're fighting to keep hold of, but are being disrupted by the location and placement of universities in those communities. Without going into it, people literally do get displaced in terms of their homes when universities are built. So there's this whole thing around cap and gown, where you've got the cap of the communities and gown of the university, but they never meet, even though the university could just be literally 1 yard away from the communities. There's this psychic barrier. But the reason why that barrier exists is because there is a clash between epistemologies of the academy and of the grassroots. So I've kind of condensed in the, what I really wanted to say, but I've kind of covered it. Yeah. So I think we should have a quick Q&A, because then maybe through the Q&A we can talk about your ideas of how you can apply your knowledge of now decolonization, decoloniality, ontology and epistemology to your areas of influence.
Okay, so I think in terms of the technical aspects, we have, I think at 5:30 the call will officially cut, so yeah, maybe 5 minutes before 25 past we'll say definitely wrap up. So yeah, for those still on the call, please submit your questions via Slido that you have, so we'll have just a short Q&A to ask. I guess one question, yeah, I've got 2 questions so far. So the first question I've got for you is, to what extent does one's empowerment shape the politics of a nation? So it's quite an abstract question there.
Depends, because if we look at identity within that circuit, in fact, what I'm going to do, I am going to just put the slide back up, because, right, it is, right, just going to put that there. Yeah. It depends on the identity of the empowerment. If we're talking about empowerment of, say, the white majority or the middle classes, and by the way, you will read in the further reading that class is racialized, is a racialized system. Yeah. So you'll read how class is just an economic expression of race, and you can go into that another time. So if we're talking about the empowerment of the elite or the empowerment of the powerful, then it shapes the nation in a harmonious way. But if we're talking about the empowerment of the dispossessed, then it shapes the nation in a really disharmonious way, or dissonant way, as can be seen with the current protests. So it's always about the situation. Mignolo also talks about situated knowledge. All of our knowledge is situated because of where we sit within the hierarchy, within the system. And it's about recognizing our situatedness to recognize where our knowledge comes from and what it inflects to. So depending on that, will answer the impact it has on a nation.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is, would you say the libertarianism movement was an important development in changing the idea of like knowledge should be taught top down, so an instruction from a certain place or a person from a higher class?
I think it was because of the hypocrisy of liberty and equality and freedom not offered to the slaves. I think it was hollow from the beginning. It was only about the owners. So libertarianism actually was a treatise of ownership It was never really a treatise of freedom and equality.
Hmm.
So from that point of view, I think it marked the downfall of Western, our Western era, if you will, our Western ideology, because from libertarianism, and we just don't have the time for me to kind of map it out, we get to capitalism, and then advanced capitalism and neoliberalism, which is where we're at now. And we're literally at the point where neoliberalism is threatening to kill the whole planet. Not, yeah, oh, please. Just, oh, gosh. So, not just through the environment, although that's the biggest threat, but just through social inequalities and the wars and kind of discord. But that all came from libertarianism and the hypocrisy of not really treating everybody, not really regarding everybody universally as human.
Okay, thank you. The next question I've got, how can we as students be involved in decolonizing our education system?
Right, so in the further reading, I'm so really happy that I did that for you. I give you a snippet of a conversation we were having in my research group about how students can do that. And in that snippet, we said that students setting up reading groups in the community, sharing some of that literature that you're discovering. So if you are reading The Wretched of the Earth, by Frantz Fanon, sharing that and setting that up. So the question is, who do you share that with? You have in the UK, I can't talk internationally, you have supplementary schools. Supplementary schools are community-led organizations that are education focused. So they're mainly set up by parents, and the parents kind of teach. Now, they were set up, and I'm going to talk now from an African and Caribbean perspective, but actually it's the same across all of the BAME acronym. For those of you who aren't in the UK, British, Asian and minority ethnic, it was set up, supplementary schools were set up to make sure that those communities got the heritage learning that was being missed out in mainstream education. So the supplementary movement has always been a radical movement because of its political stance of saying, no, the history you're teaching in school is curated and not curated to our benefit. So since you're not going to teach that history, we're going to teach it. And it traditionally, Saturdays, the supplementary schools traditionally are taught on Saturdays, and they're called Saturday schools. So as students, if you were to set up reading groups and discussion groups and reached out to supplementary schools in your area, and they tend to work with younger people, obviously, than yourselves, but who are still kind of not a million miles away from your ages. So supplementary schools obviously can work with children, but can work with people going into doing their A-levels. So you could then lead discussion groups based on your knowledge with these supplementary schools, which are ready-made sites of political resistance in the community. Apologies for those people overseas who don't have supplementary schools. I'm working in Brazil and helping them set up their version of supplementary schools with some of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon. I'm visiting professor at the Federal University of the Amazon, UFAM, and we're working with indigenous people to recapture, nurture, and really use their pre-colonial knowledges for their empowerment. But that's a whole nother story. So that's what you can do. Use your learning and share your learning with the wider community.
Is there any opportunity for us within our university systems to sort of change the curriculum that way as well? Or what advice would you give for that?
Right. So the advice I would give you all is read your handbooks. You all will have handbooks for your courses as students. you need to learn the business of higher education. It's a business. You are consumers. So you need to know why the curriculum is the way it is. And I'm going to just tell you very, very quickly why it is. We do have the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEFL, that's coming into being, but the blue ribboned thing that gets universities their block grants is research. And the way in which research is audited is through the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. So that comprises three elements. It comprises what the outputs of your lecturers, your tutors are. I think it's two public, doesn't matter, what their outputs are, and then their outputs are judged depending on, you know, whether they're world leading or whatever. Impact of those outputs. So what political impact or community or public impact did the research of your tutors have? And then the third one, which kind of will affect some of you, what is your research environment? How many PhDs do you have in your department? Because that kind of indicates the health of your research environment. Now, the reason why you need to know that is because depending on how well a university does in its audit, depends on how much money it gets for its research in a block grant allocation. The reason why that's important is because universities, they might call them different things, but universities have research centres, and research centres are run by professors. And the purpose of having a research centre is to have a cluster, a focus, a research focus that can look good for the REF to gain the university money. Now, depending on the focus of the research centre, the lecturers, your tutors, who are part of that in some shape or form, their research will have to resonate with that research centre. So if their research isn't about, say, social justice and racism, for sake of argument, then that can't really trickle down into their units and programs that you are studying, because it's not aligned to their research centre. Now, if you don't have enough Black professors, yeah, I am going to use Black in the sense of African and Caribbean in this particular sense, not just political, then the agendas for those research centres won't change, which means then the programs that are written on the research interests of your lecturers and those units won't change. So that's why you need Black senior academics, otherwise known as professors, to be able to kind of inflect change. When you talk about women, we know that the number of female professors, Black women, it's just minuscule. Out of 20,000, there's maybe 20 or 21. So you need to know the business of higher education as consumers, and I disagree with you being consumers, because back in my day it was about knowledge and another whole talk, but you are now categorized as consumers. You then need to assert your consumer rights about your education. So in a way, that's the flip side. If we're going to treat you as consumers, which I disagree with, then actually you need to really be gemmed up on your consumer rights about the type of education you are paying for and that you are getting. And I think knowing the business of higher education, knowing that you are a consumer of that business, actually puts you in a powerful position that they actually have to listen to you to do that. So I know at Goldsmiths, I don't think they have a sit-in right now because of the lockdown, but pre-lockdown, they had like a 50-day sit-in where they were kind of protesting against the whiteness, the unfair white. There's nothing wrong with a curriculum with white thinkers. It's about
the exclusionary.
it's about privileging those white thinkers or centering those white thinkers above everyone else. We should have all the thinkers from all around the world, so that we're not saying Eurocentric epistemology is up here and everyone else is down there. We'll just mention you a bit because we're ticking a box. No, actually, Eurocentric epistemology is just one of many, many, many epistemologies in the world, and that's what needs to be reflected in university curricula.
Okay.
But you can do that through your students' union, I think, as well. Your students' unions are your representative body to make those appeals.
Cool. So yeah, just in the interest of time, we had one more question, but we won't. I don't think we'll have time just because I'm conscious of the call. So
I'll try and be brief. I'll do my best.
Okay, I'll ask then. So was colonialism as discriminatory to other ethnicities as well as Africans?
Oh yes. See, I was really brief.
Yeah. There you go.
But yeah,
to fit in all the questions.
Yeah, it's not just Africans who have been colonialized.
Yeah.
So people from the Indian subcontinent had their country partitioned. And people in their country died of starvation in the millions because of colonialization under the British Empire. And so there are lots of other ethnicities. Britain at its height, I think, colonized, I don't know the figure, but it was just a ridiculous high percentage of the planet at one point was under British rule, which took in lots of ethnicities.
I think I should have answered that question. I should have just been said, just watch the Beyond series talks. We've got most of them recorded, and we've actually covered much of the British Empire to learn more about that. So thank you so much for your talk. Really insightful, abstract at times, but really in depth as well. And you've really linked it back. So thank you. Just a reminder for those that are still here, the next talk that we have is tomorrow, our final talk of the series. It was a rescheduled talk for Palestine, and we've got Professor Rashid Khalidi who will be taking that. Just a reminder, we have the two charities that we are also supporting through this series: Show Racism, the Red Card, and the Yemen Emergency Appeal. So please do donate if you can. And lastly, on Slido, we have a live poll where you can describe how you found today's talk in one word. So please do. It's great to receive feedback as well, sort of collate the results and summarize how everyone's found this talk and the talk series as a whole. So please do take part on that. And once again, a massive thank you, Dr. Ornette, for taking the talk and for being with us today. It was a pleasure.
Well,
thank you very much.
Hopefully you got a taste of how I teach. I do ramble. So often the notes I put up on Moodle for my students are kind of like the bare bones, but you need to come to my classes to get all the interesting kind of detours that I take. So hopefully it wasn't too painful for you.
No, overall, very in-depth and insightful as well. And please leave your feedback so we can know how you found it as well. So that's equally as important. Okay, well, take care. See you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.